Hello and welcome to another episode of This Much is True Crime with me, Martin Frizell, and Emeritus Professor of Criminology, David Wilson. Hello, David.
Martin, how are you? You been well?
I'm good, thank you. Had a few days away, which was really good just to clear the cobwebs, but also just to have some time to sit and be quite selfish, really, and binge, I suppose, as the youngsters might call it, binge on some great stuff that's out on telly just now. Clearly in the run up to Christmas, it's all landing on Netflix and Sky Atlantic and Paramount. And the one that I started off, we spoke about, excuse me, that I think everybody kind of is watching just now because it's kind of number one or two, is All Her Fault with Sarah Snook, which was great. And then the one you recommended to me that I've just almost finished, which is, I think, even better, is The Beast in Me with Claire Danes and Matthew Rhys, which is crikey, evil personified in that character.
And what's so interesting is that, Matthew Rhys is a Welsh actor and but of course has spent much of his career in the United States. I think delivers an incredibly persuasive American accent for one thing. And in this particular series, as you said, he is evil personified. So that willingness to be a kind of a character that the public might be a bit confused about, but a character that the public will find very difficult to sympathize with. And I think he's just extraordinary in this. And in the same way, I thought Charlie Hunnam, another British actor, was incredible in the Ed Gein story that was recently on Netflix. Some really powerful performances, I think.
Claire Danes. I just love Claire Danes. And actually, I kind of bumped into her. She was staying in the same place I was staying in Holiday a few years ago. She and her partner Hugh Dancy and their child toddler, and she was so lovely, so lovely. So I've always, since Homeland, I've always liked her. But she's brilliant in this. So if you want to catch it, it's on Netflix, isn't it? Yeah, Netflix. The Beast in Me. We're talking today, though, about true crime and for me, a truly evil man. And I never thought the day would come where we would say, David, there probably is a more prolific sex offender than Jimmy Saville. And we're talking about Neville Husband.
So Neville Husband was a catering officer in the prison system, in the prison service, and was originally from the northeast of England. Passes to become a prison officer, is transferred to Portland, Borstal at the time, becomes a catering officer whilst he's in Portland, then moves back up to the northeast and takes up a position as the catering manager. It was a singleton post, so he was the only catering manager. A singleton post in what was known at the time as the detention centre, Medomsley Detention Centre, and is going to spend the rest of his career working not just in Medomsley, but also another young offender institution called Deerbolt, and occasionally, for a very brief period of time, also works in HMP Frankland. But you're absolutely right. There have been rumors about Neville Husband, what he got up to specifically in Medomsley, and there has been a recent report about his activities in the detention centre by Adrian Usher, who's the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman. And my gosh, do the 350 pages of that report, they're such a difficult read because what one encounters is husbands' sexual abuse and on an industrial scale of the young offenders that were being sent to Medomsley and also possibly to Deerbolt and also possibly to Portland. He is just a prolific sex offender, and it was so awful reading some of the testimony of the young men that spoke to the prison's ombudsman about what they had experienced.
It's worth just spending a moment talking about what Medomsley was to start off with. There's no such thing now, I don't believe, but then it was set up to try and keep youngsters, offenders, low-level offenders, away from the hardcore prison system. So it was probably set up with good intentions. But they then went on to basically lift kids for the simplest of things from the age of 17 up until 21, for stealing some biscuits, for, on a cold day, taking a jumper or a blanket out of a car that they may have taken. Normally, those kind of crimes, or even shoplifting, those crimes these days would be community service, or maybe if it was a first offence, even let off with a warning. But they were sent to this place where some of the, inmates, I would call it, because they believe it's like a concentration camp, where they were I suppose, subjected to the most awful, awful abuse, not just from the chef, Neville Husband, in his kitchens, but it seems to have been going on with quite a few officers there, and yet it's only now that we're really hearing about the whole expanse of it.
So you're quite right. It's we have to talk about the institution and what the institution was set up to do, and we also have to remember that that institution came at a particular period in time, and really what was happening at Medomsley was the idea that people who were young men in particular, although also applied to some young women, young men in particular who were low-level offenders. They were being sent to Medomsley, not for very serious offences at all, but they were going to be taken off the streets and given what was said at the time, a short, sharp shock. They were going, and this was a kind of, and that phrase was actually used by Willie Whitelaw. This was in Mrs. Thatcher's first government. The idea was that you gave young offenders a short, sharp shock, and by doing so, you would deter them from going on to living a life of crime. And that short, sharp shock was very much supposed to be a very physical and demanding kind of incarceration where people would be marched. There would be an element of discipline, in other words. But that very, very quickly slipped over into the sharp and the shocking as much as the short. And the sharp and the shocking would include not just being shouted at, psychologically abused. It would also include, sadly, people being physically abused. And so the context in which Neville Husband was able to get away with what he did for as long as he did was also a consequence of the culture that detention centers had at the time. And, I'm friends with lots of former detention center. They were called trainees. My gosh. I'm still friends with a few people who went through the detention center, who I trust implicitly, who talk not just about Medomsley, but about other detention centers like Send and what those detention centers were like. And I'm also still in touch with a number of prison officers who had to deliver effectively the short, sharp shock, and they're still they're still very confused as to what it was they were being asked to do within that culture, and where the dividing line was between doing something that was acceptable and doing something that was morally reprehensible.
Husband died in 2010. Good riddance to him. So he's not really around now to explain or to take the full punishment for the totality of what he was up to. But there will be prison officers, governors, still around, and I know you know one of them, who were there at the time. And I think the one said he just didn't know that all this was going on. I mean, is that believable?
Yes, and that governor. So a detention center was managed by a combination of prison governors and senior prison officers, chief officers, principal officers, and the like. The problem, I think, for the particular governor that I know is that it was a very isolated institution. It was in the back of beyond, and deliberately chosen because it was in the back of back of beyond, and therefore it developed its own culture very quickly that would be able to freeze a liberal governor, and the governor that I knew was very liberal, a liberal governor out from being able to take much control of the culture of what was happening inside the jail, which isn't meant to excuse. I mean, the governor that I know who was in charge of Medhumsley for a short period of time is still traumatized himself by what now has emerged about what was happening on his watch. But in effect, Husband was able to create a set of circumstances that he had a great deal of power within the institution. He was a physically imposing man. He also was part and parcel of the Prison Officers Association. As the catering officer, he was able to establish subcultural working practices that meant that the kitchen wasn't searched as often as it should have been searched, which gave him an opportunity to sexually abuse some of the young men that were working for him in the kitchens. And of course, he was, because he was a predatory paedophile, because he was somebody who was interested in sexually abusing particularly young men, he'd worked out very quickly how to go about choosing the young men that came into the detention center that would be more pliable to what he wanted to do to them. Kids that had been brought up in chaotic backgrounds, kids that had been in care, kids that wouldn't be believed if they wanted to raise what was happening to them, and many of them did. And kids who would not get visited. You know, that's the other thing. This was a very isolated establishment. And if you weren't going to get visited from one week to the next, again, that made you very vulnerable to somebody like Husband, who would be able, frankly, to get away with rape on an industrial scale.
And it's interesting what you say, and it's probably for another day or another podcast. Children in care, of course, that brings in the whole grooming gangs scandal as well, isn't it? That we kind of, or certainly the authorities, turned a blind eye to some of those girls because they were in care. Thought perhaps it wasn't worth investigating the way they might have done if it was a nice middle class white child who'd gone off and didn't come back or was fallen into the wrong hands. But that's for another day. But it's the institutions that interest me, how this dreadful crime or multiple of crimes relating to children can happen within institutions fairly easily, whether it's Jimmy Saville and the BBC and the NHS or even the police. I'm just seeing here as well that from the figures that I can get my hands on, that the most recent ones, police paedophiles, more than 30 guilty since January 22, and that's a report from a year or so ago, so probably more than that. More than 30 police and support officers convicted of child sex abuse offences in England and Wales. David, 2 worked with children. Another was a trainee detective constable in a child abuse safeguarding unit.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it? And I start, therefore, because I'm a criminologist, with the offender. If you're a motivated offender, then you are going to find suitable victims to abuse. And therefore, where are you going to find suitable victims? You're not going to find them in the nice middle class homes that you've been describing in the main. You're going to find suitable victims if you're a motivated sexual predator by looking at kids who just simply have been regarded as immaterial. They're regarded as not as having the same agency as other kinds of children. And for me, when you're talking about the police, remember, long before he gets to Medhumsley, a Husband had been posted to Portland, again quite an isolated borstal that he was sent to. But in 1969, he's going to be arrested for having imported pornographic material from Sweden. So he's actually arrested by the police, and they take possession of the materials that he had imported from Sweden, which were about children being sexually abused in quite sadistic ways. and the police don't do anything about it. Husband says he's doing some research and gets away with it. But there are notes on Husband's personal file that talked about the fact that he had been arrested for being in possession of this extreme child sexual pornography, but he's still allowed to work in the prison system. He's still given access to young people. He's still given access to vulnerable young people. And, even from 1969, if he had just been dismissed from the prison service and prosecuted for importing he was arrested under the Obscene Publications Act. If he had just been dismissed from the prison service at that point, he may have gone on and committed other sexual offenses because, of course, he was very involved in the church. And once he leaves the prison service, he's going to train as a minister in one of the evangelical Baptist churches, and he's going to abuse children there as well. This was a motivated offender who was constantly in the lookout for suitable victims, and he was going to be able to do what he did because of the absence of suitable guardians that were going to control his behavior. Although, frankly, I get the impression from Husband, um, his behavior was never going to be controlled. He was just by the time he was at Medemsley, he knew how to get away with it for as long as he chose to get away with it.
Are there two particular types of pedophiles? Those who prey on their family or people they know, or even strangers they may come into contact with, and then those who, like Husband, like Savile, who actually make a habit of, prowling the institutions where their prey, live, work, habit.
Yeah. So there's intrafamilial pedophilic abuse, and then there's extra-familial. Husband was married. He did have a child. I don't know. I've never read anything about what happened within his family arrangements. But the other strange thing for me about Husband and the absence of a suitable guardian. In other words, an absence of senior staff at Medemsley wanting to really hold Husband to account was that Husband was allowed to take some of those young offenders in the detention center that he was abusing out of the jail and take them home. And whilst they were in his home, he would record the sexual abuse that he was engaging in with them, and also the sexual abuse they suffered at the hands of other people who are unknown to me. I don't know, the report doesn't name them. So, in other words, right from the start, he was also producing pornography that was being then presumably uploaded in some way or sold in some way before the internet to other people who were also interested in the sexual abuse of teenage boys. And Martin, for anybody who can bear to read this stuff, one of those young men who was so brave to come forward and complain about this and give evidence against Husband was a man called Kevin Young. And Kevin Young still talks, has spoken movingly to a number of outlets about the abuse that he suffered and the impact of that abuse on his life after he leaves Medemsley. This is a lifelong um, trauma that the young men who suffered at the hands of Husband have experienced. And Kevin Young spoke about all of this after he gave evidence about Husband and what Husband did. But it was that idea. I joined the prison service in 83, 84. After my training, I went to a young offender institution in the southeast of England called Huntercombe. And the idea that you would take young offenders out of the institution to your house was pretty, would have been seen as really odd. And therefore, I just, you know, there would be many, many, many members of staff at Medomsley who would know that there was something going on and that Neville Husband wasn't to be trusted.
And you like to think that because we are talking about these kind of stories more, bearing in mind that Husband carried out his atrocities between 69 and 1985, you like to think the world's moved on. We're a much more understanding, kind, considerate place. But of course, we're not, are we? Because, as I said, on the institutions, and it's not just the BBC or the NHS, but also it's sports coaches,
Yeah.
footballers, it's gymnasts, it's kind of everywhere, but also the figures as well show that we're actually almost worse than in Neville Husband's time, because again, the figures that are most recent that I could get my hands on from the NSPCC say that 87,000, this is the last known period, 2023, 87,000 sexual offences against children recorded by police. That's just about the worst they've had since they started that research 16 years ago. So either it's getting worse or more people are complaining and raising the flag. What do you think?
I think it will be the latter in particular. It's always very difficult with these statistics, but I imagine that what we've got since even Husband's time, he was going to be dismissed from the prison service, as you said. Well, no, he medically retires from the prison service and then uses the church as a way of getting access to victims. But there's now a greater willingness, I think, for young people who gain a bit of authority, young people who get older, to be able to come forward and believe that they're going to be listened to when they raise these issues about sexual abuse. So there'll be a greater willingness to come forward to talk about the abuse that they've experienced, which I think makes it difficult to make these historical comparisons. Is the problem of sexual abuse getting worse, or just more people willing to talk about it? I think there's definitely been a change in social attitudes, and those attitudes would be about listening to young people and recognizing, not just listening to young people, but recognizing the situations in which those young people would be vulnerable to being abused. And that would be looking at institutions, that would be looking at now, you're saying where adults get unsupervised access to children. That would include things like sports coaches. We're both Glaswegian lads, and we know there have been issues in relation to the Celtic football boys club. There have been issues there, because kids want to become athletes, kids want to become sports stars. And that, of course, means that parents and guardians are often encouraging relationships that they should be a bit more quizzical and questioning of.
If you're a parent with young children, you must be so worried as to, to let them out of your sight, to know, to trust the people who are going to look after them, take them away on trips, or as you said, coach them, or do anything with them in an institution. How do you know? I'm just trying to get my head around what is it that makes a paedophile become a paedophile? What makes it's a man want to do this? And why has nothing changed? What is it we're missing here in actually tackling what makes someone want to do this to a child? Why are we not tackling exactly what causes that? Or is that just biology? Or is that just something that's going to happen naturally?
Do you know, this is one of the reasons I love doing this podcast, is we get an opportunity to kind of really open up some territory, don't we? I've never accepted that, although in my experience of working with paedophiles, virtually every one of those paedophiles had themselves been sexually abused as a child. Now, I've never accepted that as an explanation, because I've usually pointed out to them Well, if you were sexually abused as a child and you know how traumatic it was for you at that time, why would you want to go and continue that kind of trauma by abusing children now? So, and people who become pedophiles, people who are interested in children, can become interested in children for all kinds of reasons. I mean, for example, I found that some of the pedophiles I've worked with, this is quite difficult, and maybe we have to do a wee bit of health warnings. Um, People that I've worked with were turned off by pubic hair, and therefore children don't develop pubic hair for a significant period of their early childhood. And so it was, and often working with that kind of person was about explaining that adults can shave their hair. They could become sexually attracted to people who shave their pubic hair. And a significant number of the pedophiles I worked with really lacked basic knowledge about sex. And often you were having to teach sex education to them about what was against the law and what was permissible within the law. Some pedophiles, to get even worse in terms of the detail, some pedophiles that I worked with were attracted to the fact that obviously children's bodies haven't developed particularly if they're 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And what they enjoyed, they would explain, was the kind of tightness of the penetration they were able to engage with. And again, you could work with them to try and explain about using condoms that were perhaps ribbed condoms. So these were really, really difficult things about that individual who becomes a pedophile. But then often because I was working a lot, I mean, I wrote about these experiences in a book called Innocence Betrayed, Pedophilia, the Media and Society. And often when I was working with those pedophiles, I became increasingly sensitive to noting just more cultural things in society more broadly. You know, the kind of sexualization of young people in the media. I mean, you've had a long and distinguished career in the media, but you will remember TV programs on various channels that had really young kids lip syncing to the music of adult pop stars. And who was being attracted to that? I kept pointing out. You know, why was at one stage, the most common plastic surgical procedure in this country was breast enhancements for under 16-year-olds, and they were being bought, that plastic surgical procedure, by parents who were responding to an under 16-year-old girl wanting to have bigger breasts. You know, why do so many adult women dress like their daughters? Why do daughters who might be 13 or 14 look so much like their mothers? You know, the kind of mini me in fashion was again something that I picked up, largely because I wrote a chapter in that book that I've just described called The Disappearance of the Party Dress. I have as you know, I have three older sisters, and when they went to a party, they had a special dress that they wore. And what they, as mothers, would say, oh no, you don't buy a party dress any longer. There's no sort of special dress that you wear for these occasions, because fashion had changed so much that young girls looked like adult women and adult women looked like young girls. And whilst I've been describing tensions or cultural tensions on girls there, let's not forget, as fathers, we're both fathers of boys, that those same social and cultural tensions to make young men look much older by having six packs is in their culture too. You know, as you know, I went on TikTok. I'm now on TikTok, and on TikTok, I see it all the time about the kind of blurring of the line about who's a child and who's an adult.
I'll just, because I know if women listening or watching will probably be raising their arms saying, excuse me, Professor, but quite frankly, we can dress any way we want to. And it's not up to any man to tell us what to do. If we want to dress young or old or, have boob jobs or have our lips done, that's up to us. And we can do that. And the focus should be on the men who are making our lives a misery by preying on us. So that's what they would say, just to sort of balance what their kind of feelings would be. And I know where you're coming from too. But in also talking about this is what may sort of turn people into pedophilia. These are intelligent people, though. They surely know right from wrong. And, whether it's a particular thing they do or don't like, on a woman's body, they still know that what they're doing is wrong, do they not?
Oh, of course they do. And also, though, you used the phrase, these are intelligent people. Pedophiles are from all walks of life, in all kinds of jobs, can have educational achievement or no educational achievement. So there's no one size fits all cookie cutter of shape of a pedophile. And some of them, as I've shared with you earlier, with some of the pedophiles I worked with, we started by giving them sex education that nobody had ever bothered to explain to them literally the facts of life, and that perhaps also revealed the a lack of willingness to discuss these issues in our culture. We've got to be much more open, I think, about sex. And because we would be more open about sex in a legitimate way, then some of these issues might not have developed in the way that I feel they have.
I think we'll probably draw a halt to it now because we've I think gone through quite a bit. I think the whole kind of pedophilia thing is fascinating. And how many is it? One book or several books you've written on it as such that people want
I,
to go
I,
and read more?
I wrote one. I wrote a book about, and so it's good, important because at the end of the pod to be hopeful. I wrote a book about the what was happening about pedophilia. The book's called Innocence Betrayed. Uh, Pedophiles, the media, and society. And when I was writing that book, I thought, my gosh, how do I end by saying anything positive about this subject? And that's when I went to Canada. I went to Canada and deliberately did research with a group of volunteers called Circles of Support and Accountability. And that is the one thing I can point to that will stop kids being abused by motivated pedophiles. It's called Circles of Support and Accountability. And that Canadian initiative came into England. And it's now called Circles UK. And so, if you want to do anything about stopping these people from making more victims, Circles UK, find out about Circles UK, because my gosh, they're looking for volunteers. They're a wonderful registered charity, and they really, really, really can make an impact on our culture.
Well, it's good to finish on a positive note. And also, if you're concerned at all about your child, bear in mind, Childline, which does an amazing job and was set up many years ago, is a lifesaver, literally, for a lot of youngsters. And also, the NSPCC have got their own helpline too. So there are avenues to go down, but it's still a massive problem. And goodness me, as if the crime and justice system in this country didn't have enough to deal with. There's all that going on too, isn't it? David, thank you for the time being. Until our next pod. Bye-bye.
Take care, Martin. I know it's been a difficult subject to discuss, but I think it was important to try at least to begin that discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye then.